So if you picked up the new firmware update for your Sony FX3 or you're just getting used to the Sony FX6, you found a new way of exposing S-Log3 to get the most dynamic range, and that's using the Cine EI, the exposure index setting on your camera. Now there's been a lot of videos and there's been a lot of confusion around Cine EI and actually how it works, and a lot of confusion on what it is in general. And in today's video, we're going to explain Cine EI because you might be doing it wrong. What's going on, guys? It's Kofi, and I'm a filmmaker and content creator based out of Toronto, Ontario. And Cine EI is one of the settings that I've used on my Sony FX6 and on the Sony FX3 as a way of exposing S-Log3 to get the most dynamic range and getting the most quality out of my image. Now, Cine EI does leverage the two base ISOs on the camera, which are 800 and 12,800. Now, a lot of you guys have a general definition of what Cine EI is, but I'm gonna start off with what Cine EI isn't. Now, what isn't Cine EI? Now, exposure index is not a way of baking in a look into your image. Whether you're using 200 or 400 or 20,000 EI, it has no bearing on the actual ISO of the camera. It's just a way of monitoring things like your LUT and to find out what images look like so you can adjust the settings to get the most out of the dynamic range stops that are given at the base ISO values on the camera. For example, in S-Log3, you're gonna get 15 stops of dynamic range. Now, the way that we should think about dynamic range is sort of like a number line that we used in grade school, where the positive numbers are going to be your brighter areas, and anything that's a negative number is going to refer to the darker side of your image. And right in the middle where 0 is, we're going to call that 18% gray, which we'll learn about a little bit later in this video. Now, all the numbers and the positives and negatives are going to function as different stops of dynamic range. And on the Sony FX6 and FX3 and S-Log3, you're going to have 15 of those stops. And that's a total, including your negative and your positive stops. Now, that's a basic overview of how dynamic range works. And at 800 ISO in S-Log3 on your Sony camera, you're gonna have varying stops and the pluses and the minuses giving you your total. Now, what Cine EI is it helps you adjust your camera settings to move within the dynamic range that's already set by the ISO in your camera. So this setting actually doesn't change your dynamic range whatsoever. On top of that, it's not a baked-in look. If you don't change any of your settings and you're shooting at 800 ISO, it doesn't matter if you're using 200 or 20,000 EI. When you put it into your editor, it's going to look exactly the same. The point of it is to give you a preview of what it looks like in the LUTs that you use in your monitor or on your camera in order for you to make the most out of your image and to make sure things aren't over or underexposed. All right, so let's move back to that number line analogy. And what 0 is something called 18% gray. Now, you might be wondering what 18% gray means, and essentially it's this guy. Now, this is a color checker with a gray side that's on it, and this gray right here is called 18% gray. And the reason why people tell you to expose for middle gray is that it's a neutral tone that's right between the blackest of blacks and the brightest of brights. And basically how you're going to use Cine EI is that you're going to expose for middle gray based on your exposure index to get the accurate amount of stops in your dynamic range that you want for the images that you're trying to make. Now, if you're confused about exposing for middle gray, basically what you want to do is use your gray card and custom set your zebras on your camera to 41%. Then all you have to do is adjust your settings until you see the zebras on the gray part of your color checker or a gray card, and either of these you could pick up on Amazon. Now, the cool thing about Cine EI is you're able to move around that 15 stops of dynamic range to either get more detail in the shadow or the highlights. For example, at EI 200, I'm gonna get 11 stops into my shadows and 4 stops into my highlights. So if I'm in a situation where I need more shadow detail and I don't have a lot of highlights in my image, I would go to 200 EI and then I would expose for 18% gray to make sure that I maximize that setting. Now, that goes up into 10 stops in the shadows and 5 in the highlights when you go up to 400, and it goes right up into +6 in your highlights and -9 if you're going to expose for 800 EI. All right, so as I was editing this video, I just realized I left out the part about why you don't want to put your Cine EI value higher than the base ISO that you're using. So we're actually going to go through different Cine EI values that are higher than 800, 1600, 2500, and 3200. And I'm going to show you some of the results that are going to happen when I expose for middle gray, and maybe why you might not want to do this. All right, so let's go 1-to-1 with our Cine EI value and our base ISO, which is both going to be at 800. And as you can see, things look pretty clean. Now, what I want you to pay attention to is the shadow and the highlight information that you're gonna see throughout this test. All right, now that we're at 1600 EI, the adjustment that I have to make is I end up underexposing on S-Log3. And as you can see, I'm getting a little bit better highlight information, but at the cost of having a little bit less shadow detail, which is gonna make a little bit more noise, especially in the black areas of this image. All right, so now we're at 2500 EI on 800 ISO. And you're starting to really notice that a lot of the shadow information is getting really noisy. However, our highlights look pretty good. They look pretty detailed, and even better when I was exposing at 800 EI at 800 ISO. All right, now 3200 EI at 800 ISO, we are all the way messed up. We have all kinds of noise going on in our shadow details, our midtones. However, our highlights look exceptionally clean. And that's one of those things that you're gonna notice. If you go back to that dynamic range chart, when you go up to the highest EI value at 800 ISO, you're gonna find there's a lot of highlight information, but there's almost none in the shadow detail. All right, so the problem with actually using a higher Cine EI value than the base that you're gonna be using is the result ends up being that you're actually gonna be underexposing on the S-Log3 profile. And when you try to bring that shadow information back up, because you robbed Peter to pay Paul to actually get more highlight information, you're giving up a lot of shadow details, meaning that it's gonna be super noisy, even though at 800 ISO, generally a lot of things are clean. Now, what my recommendation is that if you have to go that high in your Cine EI to expose your image, you might wanna go to the high base ISO, and that's what it's for, where it'll jump you up to 12,800 ISO, and it'll help you get a cleaner image if you're going to be using higher Cine EI values than the base that you're gonna be using. Now, what ends up happening is that if you're using 3200 EI on 12,800, it's gonna give you a similar effect to actually using something like 200 while you're using 800 ISO, because you're actually playing at a lower Cine EI value than the base ISO that you're using. Now, I'm gonna leave a note here. This is not the most favorable scenario because at 12,800 ISO, there's actually slightly less stops of dynamic range in the Sony S-Log3 profile. So if you watch one of Gerald Dunn's video, it's about half a stop less than if you're shooting at 800 ISO. So in this particular example, there's not enough dynamic range for me to get all the shadow detail and the highlight detail at the same time. I hope that cleared up some things about Cine EI and how actually to use it. Now, it still might be a little bit confusing, but when you understand that it doesn't bake in a look into your image, and if at anything, it helps you get the most dynamic range, especially when you're using S-Log3, it becomes a lot easier to get proper exposure and get the most out of the image quality that you have in not only your FX6, but in the FX3 with the new firmware update to use exposure index. That being said, if you have more questions down below, or you have any other information about exposure index, because I'm not a complete genius in that setting, and hopefully everybody can start to understand the setting and getting the most out of their camera. That being said, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.